Today's podcast, I'm dealing with the most important issue, and that is the issue of grief straight ahead on this podcast. For over 40 years, I've preached the Bible as a pastor across America and around the world. I've led in the work of the local church. I've been actively engaged in the political process in both our state and nation.
The purpose of the church is to stand.
I've stood alongside veterans and first responders. My heartbeat is revival, and I refuse to sit on the sidelines. So buckle up and let's tackle the issues, challenges, and opportunities facing your family and mine head on. Good morning and welcome to the podcast today. We're going to talk about a very big issue today. We're going to talk about the issue of grief. No doubt there are many folks that listen to one of my either radio, television, or podcasts that are dealing with grief, and it is a part of our life. And I want to talk about it and some of the details about dealing with grief. I want to mention that I have this book, and I'll talk about this book in the podcast today, Acquainted with Grief. When I was in high school, my desire was to work for my dad. You've heard me talk about on podcasts my relationship with my father. He was my hero. He was just that guy that could do anything, could answer any question, solve any problem. And I shined his shoes on Saturday night, and I loved him, and I wanted to work with him and for him. And of course, growing up in the day that I did, most everybody wanted to be like their dad or do what their dad or grandparents did. And so I wanted to go to Bible college and prepare to serve my dad as an assistant pastor. I was 8 years old, or 7, almost 8 years old, when he started the church at Bible Baptist in Hazard. July 1972. And so when the fall of 1982 came, I went to Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Dr. Lee Robertson was the pastor there and chancellor, founder of the school, Tennessee Temple University. And though I was homesick and though I missed home, I was fulfilling a life's dream to be my dad's assistant pastor. It was in the fall of 1983, in my sophomore year, that I was working at Hart's Auto Parts on Ringgold Road in Chattanooga, and I got a call from my dad, and my dad said, "Son," he said, "I've been sick. Well, I went to the doctor today, and the doctor tells me that I have cancer. And I have what the doctor has called lymphoma cancer, and the kind of lymphoma cancer is Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer, and the doctors say it's pretty bad, and says I probably have about 6 months to live." I can't tell you how I felt. In fact, to tell you that story now brings back that feeling of hurt and grief as I was stunned on the telephone that night when my dad told me that. I asked Dad if I could drop out of school and come home and be with him, and he was 38 years old. I was 19 years old, and he said, "Yes, you can. I want you to give your boss a 2-week notice." And so the next day when I went into Hart's Auto Parts, I told my boss, Mr. Bill Patty. I preached his funeral just a few years ago. I told Bill, I said, "Sir, my father has cancer. I just found out last night, and I'm going to go home, and I need to give a 2 weeks notice, and sir, I'm sorry." I'll never forget, Bill told me, he said, "You don't have to give a 2 weeks notice. You can go ahead and leave. I understand. I want you to be with your dad." And I remember telling him I have to work my 2 weeks. My dad wants me to work my 2-week notice. And so I did. I worked the full 2 weeks, and I remember going home. I remember how I felt in all of those days, and I remember the feelings of grief like I'd never experienced before. And I'll tell you, as I walked up and down the sidewalks of 1600 Bailey Avenue in the house dorm where I lived, I said something like this: "Lord, I don't understand. It doesn't seem fair to me that you would take a man like my father who is a preacher. He's a soul winner. He cares for people. And for him to get cancer, and I remember telling God, there are drunks, there are alcoholics, there are drug addicts that they don't care about anybody but themselves, and they're just living whatever life and doing whatever they want to do. And here my dad is a good man, and he has cancer, and that doesn't seem fair to me. And I remember those discussions. I remember the tears. I remember the convulsion of tears and the hurt that I had. And I remember driving up that road when I got home to see Dad for the first time and to realize that he had but a few months to live. And then when I saw him, I remember I hugged him and held him, and he held me. My dad was a bigger man than I am. I'm about 5'8", maybe and a half up. I'm standing on my toes and in my shoes. My dad was 6 foot tall, 215 pounds, and he was just an athletic kind of a man. And the fellow that had loved me and had disciplined me, he had 6 months to live. And I remember going from Hazard to Lexington, about a 2-hour drive back and forth to the doctors. And my dad would take a chemotherapy treatment and would be just deathly ill for days on end. Would make him sick at his stomach. And I remember we put a hospital bed in the living room so we could take care of Dad. And we were blessed that he lived 23 months. And I'll never forget, my dad made a list of things that he wanted to accomplish before he died. And all of those had to do with church. He wanted to have another revival meeting. He wanted to finish a building that he was building, and just on and on. And when he finished everything on the list, he went to heaven. And I remember Dad saying in those last few days, I should have made that list longer. So my 21st birthday, August 25th, 1985, I was with my dad on a Sunday morning at St. Joseph Hospital, the 4th floor. And Dad was already in a coma. His eyes were turned back in his head. They were giving him medicine to help him rest. And I told my mom, I said, it's Sunday morning. I better go to Sunday school or church. Dad will be disappointed if he were to find out that it's Sunday and I'm not in church. The last thing I'd get would be a whipping. And so I went to church. I had a friend that took me to church. I couldn't wait to get back to the hospital room, and I prayed. The whole time I was at church. I went to Faith Baptist Church over on, I believe it's Garrett Avenue off of Versailles Road there. Pastor Don Strange, who had befriended my father, I went to church there. And I remember him preaching on the shipwreck and the snake bite, and I went back to the room, and I was so glad to see that he was still alive. I sat down on the side of the bed, and I took his hand that used to be strong and tough, and now it was white and wrinkled, and I held his hand in mine, and I said, Dad, it's Sunday, and I went to church today. And Brother Don Strange preached a good message today. He preached on the shipwreck and the snake bite, and they feared that they would all lose their life because of the storm that came as they were on the boat that night. And an angel came to Paul, and he told him, he said, and I couldn't think of what the angel said. And my dad focused his eyes at me one more time, and he spoke his last words, and he said, fear not. And I said, yes, Dad, that's what the angel said, fear not. And those were the last words. It was August 27 at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that Dad went to heaven. And the grief, it's hard to believe it's 40 years later, and I still have that burden. I have that last pair of my dad's shoes in my apartment. I mean, in my, I don't live in an apartment. I live in a house with my wife, in my closet, and I keep those shoes shined, and still do. And there was a time I wish I could have got rid of that grief. Today, it is the only thing I have left to love him and remember him, other than knowing I'll see him again. Now, that's my story. And you have one. And we all have times of grief, and I want to talk to you about it today. In fact, I'm recording this podcast, and I've done 2 funerals today. At 11 o'clock this morning, I did a funeral for an 86-year-old lady that was a dear friend. and a member of our church for the last 18 years. What a precious lady she was. I finished that funeral at about 11:45. I drove to the church, and at 1 o'clock, I did a funeral for a child that never lived a day, died when it was born. And as I finished the funeral today, I watched the funeral director take that little casket, it was about this long, and hand it to Mom and Dad, and they carried it out, and I followed behind them. I heard the sobs, I saw the tears, and that's where I live. I have funerals often. I help people who are hurting, and I desire to help folks that are hurting. I'm going to talk to you today about the process of grief, and I hope I can help you with it. In this book, I give an outline of how to deal with grief, of what we do in dealing with grief. And I just want to run through that list, and I have the outline and notes here before me. And here's what I instruct folks to do. By the way, I have teenagers who grieve. They've lost a mom and dad, or they've lost a brother or sister. I have parents who grieve. They have buried a child, and that's a tough one. When parents bury children. And then it's just a natural part of life when we bury our parents. My mother's still living, but my dad and my father-in-law, they are already in heaven, and that grief is real. And let me talk to you about it. Here's the first thing we need to do. We have to write down the facts that have brought us grief. Now, I've talked about some natural things, but there are some things that bring grief that I haven't talked about. For example, if you have been neglected, if you haven't been loved, or worse, if you have been abused, and you have faced abuse maybe physically, maybe emotionally, maybe you've been cursed and yelled at. I'm dealing with folks today that was their life growing up. And as an adult, they're trying to overcome that. We need to look at what causes us grief, what hurts our grief. You see, if I write down what I have grief for, the answer for me is fairly easy. The answer for me is there's a heaven. I'll see him again. I think of what Job said in Job 19:25, 6 and 7. He said, I know my Redeemer liveth. He's going to return. There's going to be a resurrection, going to be a reunion. And so with that hope in the future, I get help from my grief pretty quick. And now it comes and it goes, and I never know when that grief is going to come. I never know. You never know when you're going to feel like crying. And by the way, we'll talk about grief is not just tears. Grief has a lot of emotions. We'll come to that in just a moment. But first of all, let's identify where the grief comes from. Maybe the grief of a broken relationship, marriage that has ended in heartache. Divorce is more difficult than death. Death is final. It's natural. We understand that. But when divorce comes, it brings a grief that is very difficult to deal with. Children who have been neglected, children who have been given up for adoption. We have folks in our church. One man in our church, he's a deacon, a great gentleman. I mean, a dear friend. He was taken to a children's home when he was just a toddler boy and left. And he had to deal with that. He had to deal with that rejection all of his life. So first of all, if we're going through a process of grieving, let's talk about, let's write it down. Let's look at it. What is it that causes our grief? Let's look at it at face value. Sometimes that develops. Sometimes one thing opens to another. You begin, and I'm not trying to relive pain. I just want to identify what the grief is. Then the next thing we want to do, and this is chapter 3 in this book, Acquainted with Grief, we want to deal with the emotions of grief. When we think of grief, most of the time, we just think of tears. We just think of crying. But there's far more emotions than just that of crying. There are the emotions of anger. Sometimes we get mad. Let's just be honest about it. We get mad at God. We don't understand. Or sometimes we get mad at ourselves and we say, I should have done more. I should have been better to my mom and dad. I should have visited mom and dad more. Maybe if I'd have helped him, he would have. If I'd have helped mom, if I'd have helped my family, they would have lived. And so there's anger, there's blame, there's confusion, there is sorrow, there is tears. That's the obvious one. And so we want to identify all of the different emotions that come in grief. And I will tell you, there are times that all of them come at once, and then I mean, it feels like a fight on the inside that's just pulling you apart. And when you have blame and anger and bitterness and grief and sorrow and tears and confusion and questions, you have it all at once. That's difficult, but that is how grief is. Grief is like a roller coaster. And I'm not talking about an old-time one that's just up and down. I'm talking about the new ones. They go up and down. They go around and around. They go upside down. And sometimes grief has you to the place that you don't know what direction you're going, or you don't know what to do next. And so we have to identify all those emotions. And what I tell folks I like to do, I just like to take a piece of paper and say, today I was angry. I was angry at God. Didn't understand God. And by the way, don't misunderstand what I say when I say I'm angry at God or I'm confused at God. God's my heavenly Father. He loves me. Sometimes we just have to tell God, God, I don't want to be mad. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to doubt you, but I do today. Help me to understand. I can't ignore the emotions of grief if I'm going to deal with them. So I write down all the emotions of grief. And then I'll give you this, and this important. Rest is important to deal with grief. When I say rest, rest is not a vacation as we would define it today. I think today the devil uses our need for rest to put us in a trap to get us. When I read the Bible, and I read, for example, Mark chapter 6 about the disciples and all that they had been through, they'd been extremely busy in the ministry, and Jesus had said to them, you've been so busy, you've not had the leisure to eat a meal. Then John the Baptist was beheaded, and then they did the funeral for him, and then they came to Jesus, and Jesus said, let's go apart and rest a while. Before they got on the boat, a great crowd of people identified them, and they came, and Jesus started teaching the people. Can you imagine being in the car ready to go on vacation, and Dad starts talking to the neighbor? 10 minutes and 30 minutes and an hour and 2 hours. It's like, come on, Dad, we're going on vacation. And Jesus is just teaching and teaching and teaching. They interrupt Jesus, and they tell him, Jesus, send the people away. It's time for them to go eat. They wanted to go rest. Then they finally get on the boat, and when they do, the big storm comes. Isn't that the way life is? You plan a vacation, you have a flat tire. Plan a vacation, and the engine goes out. That's what happened to the disciples. But finally, they got to that place of rest, and we learned something about rest. I'm not talking about making your mind so busy you can't deal with your grief. We can't do that. I'm talking about rest. I'm talking about time alone. I'm not talking about time on a cell phone. I'm not talking about time on a tablet. I'm talking about time alone with God. Talking about rest time, and I'll not go into the details because I have a lot of ways to go, and I'm halfway through my time here as far as my podcast is concerned. But I have to rest, and I got to find ways that I can sleep, that I can pray, that I can let God speak to my heart. So rest is important. Then the next thing I teach folks, and I want to say about dealing with grief, hope will return. Excitement will return. Don't say, well, I'll never enjoy life again. You will, and the hope will return, and the joy will return. And I deal with this in the book in chapter 5, waiting for hope to return. Have you ever had times where you had a stomach virus and boy, you were so sick? It didn't matter what anybody offered you to eat. You didn't want it. It didn't matter if it was a T-bone steak. Didn't matter if it was a hamburger or pizza. You didn't want it. I mean, you didn't want a cracker. You didn't want a glass of milk. You were sick. And grief treats us that way. When we're wounded in spirit, a wound hurts if somebody hits it or if somebody tries to show attention or affection. We don't want anybody to shake our hand, let alone to hit us when we're in grief, and grief is like a sickness. But you want to make note, hope will return. When I think of Job, we usually look at Job's life in the beginning when the tragedies come, and Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job says, the Lord gave and the Lord have taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And then we go to the end of the book where God is restoring everything he had tenfold. But there's about what many believe is a 7-year period of time of Job's grief. Job asks the question, and you can read Job chapter 7, Job chapter 19. He says, Lord, are you never going to answer me? Are you never going to give me any hope again? At least you could answer me. But there was a quietness and a deadness, and that's the way grief is. And then all of a sudden in Job 19:25, he looks into the future and he just out of the blue says, my Redeemer liveth. And so hope will return. Perhaps you're in the midst of grief today, and you think, I'll never enjoy this place or these memories again. I remember going home and finding my dad's things for the first time. The chair that he sat in, the chair at the table he sat in, it remained empty until we left and grew up, and those are difficult things. To look in the closet and see his suits, to see his Bibles, to see all of those things. Sometimes you think hope will never return, but it does return. I want to go on to the next. There's so many things I want to say that I want to go to the next thing. Number 6, the Bible has a lot to say about grief. And there are some amazing verses that help us. I'm going to see if I can find a verse here that was just an amazing verse. Yeah, here it is. Isaiah 43:2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. And there's a multitude of verses. There is a multitude of verses that help us with dealing with grief. And I want to say, let the Word of God speak to your heart. Now, I want to warn you about something. When you first begin to read the Bible, and you first begin to find verses, it's like somebody, when you have stomach virus, offering you something to eat. And you may think, what's wrong with me? You mean I don't want the Bible? I don't want to hear singing? Now listen to me. There are times in the hospital and times at folks' sickness that we say, come on, you got to eat. Just take a little drink. That's how you have to do when you're hurting really hard, when you're hurting and grief is so strong, and you pick up the Bible and you say, I don't want the Bible. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to sing. You have to do like a person who is sick. And we'll say, come on, take just a drink. Is there anything you can think of that you want? Do you want some milk? Do you want a milkshake? Do you want a piece of candy? Anything. Can you drink a little water? But I want to say the Word of God is what we need. You have to take even just a little bit. So the Word of God is important in dealing with grief. Now, let me give you the next statement, and this is number 7 of 12, and I need to hustle a little bit here. Grief can make you bitter, but grief can make you better. Grief can make you bitter, or grief can make you better. I did the funeral for the Franco's little baby. Do you know that's the second child that I've conducted a funeral service for them with an infant child? Here's what was interesting. Pastor Romeo Hernandez, who was doing the translating today, before we went in to do the funeral, I said, Brother Hernandez, I'd forgotten, but I remember now you and your wife several years ago had a baby that died in infancy. You said, yes, sir. It was just 3 days old. And just a couple of days ago, my wife and I went down in the Lexington Cemetery. There's a place for babies. It probably has 200 plus, maybe 300. I don't know how many little infant graves are there. But his becomes so sweet. You see, he let God minister to him in his grief, and today he was able to minister to another family because he found that God's grace is sufficient. I'm thinking of sermons that I want to preach right now. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the Bible talks about the God of all comfort who comforteth us in our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort others in their times of tribulation and trial. And so grief can make you bitter, or grief can make you better. Let me give you the next thing to do if you're dealing with grief. And one of these might help you. 3 of these might help you. All of these might help you. But take what will help you in your grief today. Here's another thing to do. Number 8. Let's find a friend. Let's find someone in grief that we can help. Even though you're hurting, help somebody else that's hurting. Here's what the Bible says, Psalm 126, 5 and 6. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. What does that mean? If you'll sow while you're hurting, you'll reap in joy. There's somebody you could help today. There's somebody else, even if you just sat and cried with them while they weep. There's somebody you could visit with today, somebody you could speak up and talk to today that's lost a child, that's lost a parent, that's lost a sibling. Help somebody in need. Now, you may say, I don't want to do that. Can I tell you something? You have to have the character and you have to have the faith to overcome grief, or grief will destroy your life. You can't let that happen. You can become a better person. So find somebody that you can help in their grief. Number 9, being in the right places during grief is so important. Don't feed your grief, feed your hope. Now, we have folks in our church, they regularly go to the cemetery and visit a loved one. I have a family in church. They have 5 girls. They have 2 little graves of infants that they go visit. Now, they love those 5 girls, but that grief reminds them of how God has restored and blessed and helped them in their life. But they keep themselves in the right places. And so I say, be in the right place. Be with the right people. You need to be with folks that encourage you. You need to be with folks that help you. Don't say, I don't feel like going to church, and stay home and nurse your grief. Go nurse your hope at church. You'll go to church, and you know what will happen? The church will sing your parents' favorite song that you just buried. You'll go to church and they'll sing the favorite song of your loved one that just passed away. Or you'll be reminded of of being mistreated or being hurt. But you have to go to places where you nurse your hope. Don't nurse your grief. I'll give you the next thing. Number 10. You want to prevent what grief can become. I spoke about this before. It can make you bitter. It can make you better. Grief can make you angry. Grief can make you mean. Grief can make you hateful, or grief can make you better. You have to be careful. You don't say, I'm just gonna sit here in my grief. I'm not going to do that. Don't, because grief won't stay the same. It always gets worse. Grief will become anger, or grief will make you better. Grief will cause you to have a harshness toward others, or grief will cause you to have a heart and help toward others. So be careful not to nurse your grief because of what it can become. Then the number 11 of the 12 things is the potential benefits of grief is to help you to become kind and sweet and helpful. Again, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 tells us about the fact that God gives us comfort not just to help us through the trial, but he gives us comfort that we can help somebody else in their time of trial. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul tells us he had a thorn in the flesh. He described it as a messenger of Satan to buffet him. And he said, then God's grace is sufficient for me. And then the grace that was sufficient for Paul then used that grace to help others to find help in the time of difficulty. So the potential for grief, because my heart was broken as a 19, 20, 21-year-old young man, it has helped me to be a pastor that loves his people. You know, I don't doubt that there are preachers who could do a far greater job in preaching and teaching, maybe leading the church. I don't know anybody that can love my people like I love them. I've been with them through the difficult and the hard times. I've preached their funerals. I've helped them during the times of hurt and prayed for them in their time of sickness. And you know why? Because of the grief I've experienced in life. Then you may say, well, preacher, I'm not facing any grief. No, you may not be, but everybody is preparing for how we're going to deal with grief later. How do you deal with the small problems of life? How do you deal with the disappointments of life? How do you deal with things that hurt you now? Do you sulk? Do you hide? Do you miss church? Do you lay your Bible down? Do you close your songbook? If you do those things in the little trials of life, that's what you will do in the big trials of life. I had written the manuscript for this book, Acquainted with Grief, and I'd written 11 chapters, and I felt like something was missing. And though it's a small little book, I still wasn't finished with it, and the manuscript was finished probably for 2 years. It was my 25th anniversary as a pastor here. That was 10 years ago in May. And I got word one Saturday that one of our families that had been on vacation had been in a terrible automobile accident. We would later find out that Brother Avalar died and his 3 sons died. It was the most difficult day and most difficult period of a funeral and funerals I'd ever done. I had 4 caskets lined up across the front of the auditorium as I preached the funeral for Dad and 3 of his sons. His wife and daughter survived and mother survived, and they're still active in church today and still serving the Lord. But I learned something from watching Mrs. Avalar. I watched her respond, and my wife and I flew to Texas where she was in the hospital, and when she came out of the coma, she started asking for her husband, and my wife and I got there just a few hours later. And I remember being in the hospital room, and she said, "Preacher, my husband hasn't been to see me, and I don't know why." And I said, "Mrs. Avalar, I'm sorry to tell you, but in the accident, your husband was taken to heaven." She bowed her head and she wept. Then she looked at me and she said, "What about my little Matthew?" "Oh, my little Matthew loves church, don't he, preacher?" Little Matthew would not miss church. Even when he was supposed to go to the nursery, he would say, "Mommy, I be good. Let me go to church." He wanted to wear a tie like the preacher. He always wanted to have a Bible, even though he couldn't read it. Just a little fella Matthew was. And she would say, "If you'll be good, I'll let you go to church." And he would sit there because he didn't want to go to the nursery. He wanted to be a big boy and come to church. "Preacher, how's my little Matthew?" And I said, "Sister Avalar, all 3 of your boys are with their daddy in heaven. All of them went to heaven during the accident." She bowed her head and she wept again. And then she asked me a question that she had asked me several times through the years of serving as her pastor. She said, "What am I supposed to do now?" You see, every time she faced a trial, every time she faced a problem, she would come and she'd say, "Preacher, my boys won't behave. What do I need to do?" And we would talk about Bible instruction. How do I get my boys to get their homework done? How do I get them to learn how to work hard? Every time she faced a problem, she would say, "What does the Bible say? What am I supposed to do?" You know what she did in her big grief? She said, "What am I supposed to do now?" And I told her, I said, "Well, we can't understand, but we have to trust the God that does understand. So let's keep serving Him. Let's stay in church. Let's keep doing what your husband had been doing." He was a great soul winner. He was a great servant of the Lord. And you know what she did? She came to the funeral. She stayed in church. She's still serving God. You know how she learned to deal with her grief? During the trials of life, all the small ones, she said, "What does the Bible say I'm supposed to do?" And during that time, she trained herself on what to do when grief comes. You're preparing for grief now. I trust that the podcast has been a help to you today as we talk about the issue of grief. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being with us today.